I didn't realize I was being set up at first. When my manager called me into his office that Monday morning, he didn't look angry. He didn't look rushed either. That alone should have warned me. In our department, calm usually meant someone else was about to take the hit. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and said my name the way people do when they're about to sell you something that only benefits them. "We've got an opportunity," he said. "Not a problem. Not a mess. An opportunity." He explained it slowly, carefully. A high-risk internal project that had already failed twice under 2 different teams. A client who was still paying, but watching closely. A deadline that had been moved up, for strategic reasons. Budget frozen. Stakeholders impatient. Then came the part that mattered. "You'll lead it," he said. "Alone?" I asked. "For now," he replied, smiling. "Lean and agile." That was the phrase he liked to use when there was no support coming. I waited for him to mention a team, or a senior analyst, or at least partial coverage from another department. None of that came. Just silence and that same polite smile, like he'd already decided how this conversation would end. "If this works," he continued, "it'll be a great visibility moment for you." "If? And if it doesn't?" I asked. He shrugged, casual. "Well, high-risk projects come with high accountability." That was when it clicked. Not fully, but enough to make me uneasy. High accountability meant my name on the report. My name on the post-mortem. His name nowhere near it. I didn't agree right away. I asked questions. About access. About authority. About whether I could escalate blockers directly to leadership. He answered all of them with the same vague confidence. "We'll support you," he said. Not "I will." "We will." A word that meant nothing without names attached. When I left his office, my calendar was already blocked. 6 weeks. No buffer. No backup. Just milestones and red flags disguised as optimism. At my desk, I pulled up the project history. That's when I saw the truth in plain text. 2 previous leads. Both had left the company within 3 months of the project failing. Officially, it was career progression. Unofficially, everyone knew they'd been burned. I checked the risk register. Half the issues were unresolved. Vendor dependencies, data, integrity concerns, compliance sign-offs that were still marked pending. This wasn't a challenge. It was a cleanup operation with a scapegoat. I considered pushing back, walking into HR, asking for written guarantees. But I also knew how that would look. Difficult, not a team player. Afraid of responsibility? That's how people like him win. They don't force you. They corner you politely and wait for you to step forward on your own. So I said yes, not because I trusted him, because I wanted to see the whole board before I moved. That night, I stayed late, not working, reading, emails, old approvals, meeting notes. I mapped who had touched what, and more importantly, who had quietly stepped away right before things went bad. So one pattern stood out. Every major decision bottleneck led back to my manager. Every delay had been reframed as execution issues. Every risk that materialized had been something he'd waved through weeks earlier. He wasn't unlucky. He was insulated. I drove home around 11 p.m., hands tight on the wheel, replaying his smile in my head. The way he'd said opportunity. The way he'd said accountability. By the time I got home, I understood the real test wasn't the project. It was whether I'd fail loudly or survive quietly. And if I survived, I had a feeling he wouldn't be as pleased as he pretended to be. The first week told me everything I needed to know. Not because anything exploded, but because nothing moved unless I pushed it myself. Every request I sent disappeared into polite silence. Access tickets stayed under review. Vendor emails came back with vague replies about approvals they were still waiting on. Legal forwarded my questions to compliance. Compliance sent them back to legal. Finance asked for documentation that didn't exist because the previous team had never been allowed to create it. And every time I escalated, My manager had the same response. Just keep it moving. That sentence became his shield. When I asked for temporary support from another analyst, he nodded sympathetically and said, "Let's see how far you can get first." When I asked for written confirmation that I had authority to override certain blockers, he replied, "Let's not overcomplicate things." Overcomplicate. That's what people say when they want deniability. I started working 12-hour days, then 14. I ate at my desk, slept light, and woke up already behind. My inbox filled faster than I could clear it, and every message carried the same unspoken pressure. This is on you. Colleagues stopped making eye contact, not because they didn't like me, but because proximity is dangerous. When a project smells like failure, people protect themselves quietly. They stop being seen near you. They stop being copied on emails. They become busy when you walk over. One afternoon, I overheard two senior managers talking near the coffee machine. "Isn't that the one he put on the legacy fire?" "Yeah, solo." A pause. "Brave." "No," the other said, "disposable." They didn't see me standing there. I didn't interrupt them either. That was the moment irritation turned into something colder. I stopped assuming good faith. Instead of asking for approvals verbally, I followed up in writing. Instead of trusting timelines, I built my own. Instead of waiting for access, I documented every delay, date, owner, impact. Late one night, while reconciling a data discrepancy that shouldn't have existed, I noticed something strange. The issue traced back to a decision made months earlier, before I was anywhere near the project. The approval signature was familiar, my manager's. I checked another failed milestone. Same thing. Another exception? Same initials. He hadn't been unlucky. He'd been wrong, and clever enough to let others absorb the fallout. The realization hit hard, not emotionally, but structurally. This wasn't about competence. It was about positioning. If the project failed, I'd be the execution lead who couldn't handle complexity. If it succeeded, he'd be the leader who empowered autonomy. I confronted him carefully, not accusing, just clarifying. "Some of these risks were locked in before I joined," I said during our one-on-one. "I'll need your backing if they escalate." He leaned back, expression neutral. "Let's focus on solutions, not history." That was the answer. No backing, no ownership, no record. Walking back to my desk, I understood something important. This wasn't about surviving the workload, it was about surviving the narrative. So I changed strategy. I stopped trying to look strong. I started trying to be undeniable. Every decision I made was logged. Every blocker had an owner named. Every risk escalation included dates and prior approvals. Not emotionally, just factually. I worked faster, yes, but I also worked smarter. I designed fail-safes where I could. I created parallel tracks, so one delay wouldn't sink everything. I built contingency documentation no one had asked for, but everyone would need when things went wrong, because they always do. By the end of week 3, the pressure shifted. People started replying faster. Meetings got rescheduled around my availability, and my manager, suddenly, began asking for updates he could share upward. That's when I knew something was coming, and whatever it was, it wouldn't be subtle. The shift didn't announce itself. It never does. It arrived as a calendar invite. Executive sync. Project status. 30 minutes. Mandatory. No agenda. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Meetings like that don't exist to solve problems. They exist to assign gravity. And gravity in corporate spaces always pulls blame downward. The morning of the meeting, my manager stopped by my desk for the first time in weeks. Not to help, not to ask questions, just to be seen. "Big day," he said lightly. "Let's keep it high level." High level meant selective. In the conference room, the air felt rehearsed. Leadership dialed in. Finance. Legal. Two people I'd never spoken to but who clearly had opinions already formed. My manager started the update. He talked about vision, about resilience, about unexpected complexity. He used my name once, only to say I'd stepped up under pressure. Then came the pivot. There are still execution risks, he said, voice calm, and timelines are tight. Eyes turned to me. I didn't panic, not because I was brave, but because I'd been expecting this exact moment. When the CFO asked why a particular dependency was unresolved, my manager answered before I could. We're still waiting on final validation, he said. The team is working through it. Team. I spoke up. Actually, I said, keeping my voice level, that validation was requested 6 weeks ago and approved 3 months before I joined. The room went quiet, not frozen, just attentive. That's worse, I continued, carefully. I've documented each delay along with prior approvals and current blockers. If you'd like, I can walk through them. There was a pause. Then the CFO said, Please do. I shared my screen. Not dramatically, not emotionally. Just a timeline, names, dates, decisions. Every time a risk appeared, I showed when it had been approved. Every time a delay was cited, I showed the email chain. Every time accountability drifted, I anchored it back to a decision point. I didn't look at my manager. I didn't have to. Halfway through, Legal asked a question that hadn't been part of the plan. Finance followed. The tone changed. Not confrontational, just curious. Curiosity is dangerous when you've been hiding behind vagueness. By the end of the meeting, no one said the word failure, but no one said execution risk either. After the call, my manager didn't speak to me. He gathered his things and left the room without eye contact. That silence told me more than any confrontation could. Later that afternoon, an email went out requesting a full risk audit, retroactive. The request didn't come from him. It came from above. That was my moment of clarity. Not relief, not victory. Understanding. I wasn't fighting a project. I was standing in the middle of a slow collapse, one that had been deferred, disguised, and redirected until there was no one left to stand in front of it but me. Except now, I wasn't alone. People started asking me questions directly, not him. Me. They wanted documents, explanations, context. I gave them all of it, calmly, professionally, without commentary. That night, I sat in my car after work longer than usual. Engine off. Dashboard dark. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt awake. Because once you see how the game is played, you can't unsee it. And I knew something else then, too. If the project succeeded, he would take credit. If it failed, the audit would finish what the timeline had started. Either way, this was no longer about survival. It was about consequences. The audit didn't arrive like a storm. It seeped in. First, compliance asked for access to shared folders that hadn't been touched in years. Then finance requested historical forecasts, for context. Legal followed with questions so precise they could only come from someone who already knew where to look. The office felt different, quieter. Conversations stopped when certain names came up. Calendars filled with working sessions that didn't invite everyone. My manager started disappearing, not officially, not enough to be noticed by HR, but enough that his chair stayed empty longer than usual. When he did show up, he smiled too quickly and spoke too carefully, like someone rehearsing sincerity in front of a mirror. One afternoon, he called me into a small conference room. He closed the door. I think things might be getting misinterpreted, he said. Audits tend to snowball. That was his way of saying, stop talking. I've been fully transparent, I replied, exactly as requested. He nodded, eyes tight. Of course. Just remember, alignment matters. We don't want to confuse leadership. There it was. Not a threat. A reminder. I didn't argue. I didn't promise anything either. 2 days later, the vendor issue everyone had been avoiding finally detonated. Not because of my work, but because of a clause my manager had personally signed off on, overriding internal guidance to move faster. Finance froze payments. Legal halted integration. The client asked for a formal explanation, and suddenly my calendar exploded. Emergency calls, executive sessions, late-night messages asking if I was available right now. I answered all of them. I brought documentation. I brought timelines. I brought nothing that wasn't already written. During one particularly long call, someone asked the question no one had wanted to hear. Why was this approved without secondary review? Silence. Then my manager spoke. We made the best call with the information we had. I unmuted. The approval was granted on March 14th, I said evenly. At that time, the risk memo flagged this exact outcome. It was marked as accepted by a single signer. I shared the page. His name was there. No commentary followed, no confrontation, just a quiet acknowledgement and a request to move on. But chaos doesn't need noise to do damage. By the end of the week, leadership had reassigned oversight of the project. Temporarily, they said. My manager wasn't included in the new distribution list. I was. That alone was enough. People think reckoning looks dramatic. Raised voices, public firings. It rarely does. More often, it looks like exclusion. Meetings you're no longer invited to. Decisions made without your input. Silence where authority used to be. One evening, as I packed up, I saw him at his desk, staring at his screen like it had betrayed him. He didn't look angry. He looked confused, as if he couldn't understand how the story had slipped away from him. The project stabilized. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to remove urgency. Enough to shift attention from me to the bigger picture. And with urgency gone, scrutiny remained. That was the real consequence. Because scrutiny doesn't fade when things calm down. It sharpens. And I knew then the reckoning wasn't finished. It was just no longer loud. The end didn't come with an announcement. There was no meeting, no goodbye email, no dramatic pause where everyone pretended not to look. One Monday morning, my manager simply wasn't there. His calendar disappeared first. Then his access badge stopped working. By noon, his name vanished from the org chart like it had been a typo someone finally corrected. People noticed, but quietly. In corporate life, curiosity has limits. Most people understand when not to ask questions they don't want answered. By the afternoon, conversations had already shifted forward. Who would take over? What would change? What needed fixing next? No one asked me how I felt about it, and that told me everything. The project didn't become perfect. It didn't need to. It became stable, documented, and predictable. The three things it had never been before. We reset expectations with the client, renegotiated timelines based on reality, and rebuilt trust, not through promises, but through consistency. I stayed on, not as a hero, not as a savior, just as someone who finished what he started. Leadership thanked me in a way that wasn't performative. No applause, just clarity. My role was formalized, authority written down, support assigned instead of implied. For the first time since it began, the work felt normal. A few weeks later, I ran into someone from another department in the elevator. He hesitated, then said, "That situation, you handled it well." I nodded. That was enough. Because the truth is, I didn't win by outplaying anyone. I won by refusing to disappear quietly. I didn't shout. I didn't leak. I didn't sabotage. I documented. I waited. I stayed present. People like my former manager don't expect resistance. They expect exhaustion. Silence. A resignation letter written at midnight. They build systems where survival looks like compliance. I chose something else. On my last day assigned to the project, I shut down my laptop, cleared my desk, and walked out at a reasonable hour. No one stopped me. No one needed to. Outside, the air felt lighter than it had in months. Not because something dramatic had ended, but because something corrosive had. I understood something then finally. Survival isn't loud. It's consistent. And accountability doesn't arrive as revenge. It arrives as records, timelines, and consequences no one can argue with. My manager had thrown me into a high-risk project, alone. He just hadn't expected me to stay standing long enough for the truth to catch up to him. I went home that night, cooked dinner, and slept without setting an alarm. For the first time in a long time, that felt like the real victory.